I know when we start talking about airplanes and space and Apollo, Jim Bridenstine gets real fired up, so I got to get him up here right now. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the NASA Administrator, James Bridenstine.
Tom, thank you for your amazing leadership. The USA Pavilion is in good hands with Common Worldwide, and you're stepping up not only to carry all of the effort around the pavilion, but also leading efforts like this and making sure that we're getting the message out about how the United States of America is going to Paris. And when we go to Paris, we're going to lead. And we want to have international partners, partners in commerce, and that's why it's the USA Partnership Pavilion. And so we're glad to be a part of it. I also think it's important that we think about what today is. When we go to Paris, we're going to go to Paris, we're going to go to France, and it's going to be free. It's going to be democratic. And today, of course, is June 6th, and we are honoring our fallen soldiers who fought on D-Day in France, in Normandy, so many years ago. And what an amazing opportunity to be here on this day to talk about our going to France for this USA Partnership Pavilion and bringing together really all the nations of the world to figure out how we can collaborate, cooperate in a new commercial enterprise. I also want to thank the National Press Club for being willing to step up and host this event. And I think the big thing that I'm excited about is the fact that this USA Pavilion is going to be commemorating Apollo. We are celebrating next month 50 years of the Apollo program. 50 years since Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped on the moon. And it just so happens that 50 years later, we have a president that is committed to going back to the moon. And I like to say going forward to the moon. Not just to repeat Apollo, but in fact, this time to go sustainably, to stay. To build an architecture where we will have access to all parts of the moon whenever we want. And that includes humans. It also includes robots and rovers and landers. And if you look at the President's Space Policy Directive 1, it says to go to the moon sustainably. In other words, to stay. To go with commercial partners, Secretary of Commerce, and to go with international partners. And that's one of the reasons we go to Paris as NASA, because all of the heads of the space agencies from around the world will be there. And we will have opportunities to share with them what our plans are, the direction we're going. And when we do this sustainable return to the moon, we want to bring our international partners with us in a major way. So right now we have announced that we're building the gateway in orbit around the moon. We put together a budget request that enabled us to get to the moon by 2028. The President and the Vice President, who chairs the National Space Council, determined that 2028 wasn't good enough. They wanted to know, what does it take to accelerate? The longer this goes, the more political risk there is. And the reason we're not on the moon right now, in fact, the reason we're not at Mars right now, is because of the political risk. In other words, you go back in time, you look at the vision for space exploration, or before that, the Space Exploration Initiative. Each one of these ultimately was a plan to get back to the moon, and each one of them, the timeline was too long. Political winds change, administrations change, Congresses change, budgets change, priorities change, and we never were able to get back to the moon. So what they said is, we got to go faster, we need to retire the political risk. NASA can handle the technical. How do we retire the political risk? Well, we're going faster. They didn't just say make it happen. They said, what do you need to make it happen? We gave them a budget request, an amendment to the budget request to accelerate the path. And certainly they delivered. And in fact, none of the money that we're getting is actually going to come from within the agency. This is new money to NASA that will enable us to develop this sustainable return to the moon. So when we go to the Paris Air Show, we will be there with commercial partners. We will be there with international partners. And we will be sharing the vision for a sustainable return to the moon so that we can ultimately retire the technical risk at the moon, prove that we can learn how to live and work on another world. And this is also exciting. Take all of that capability that we develop, onto another world, namely Mars. So ultimately, when we do it this time, unlike 1969, this time when we go, we're going to lead a coalition of nations to the moon under a sustainable architecture for the long term. I also think it's important, Secretary Ross already covered this, but when we think about this program, 50 years ago, we called it Apollo. It just so happens that Apollo has a twin sister. The twin sister of Apollo is named Artemis, and she happens to be the goddess of the moon in Greek mythology. This time when we go to the moon, it will go under a banner named after Apollo's twin sister. It is, in fact, the Artemis program. And because we have a very diverse, highly qualified, and very talented astronaut corps, when we go to the moon, as Secretary Ross said, the Artemis program will be delivering the first woman to the surface of the moon. That's important. Why? Because I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I want her to be able to see herself having all of the opportunities I believed I had growing up. And the astronaut corps of today is very different than the astronaut corps of the 1960s and early 1970s. Back then, it was all military pilots, fighter pilots, test pilots, and that's how you got to the astronaut corps. These days, and there were zero opportunities back then for women. These days, we have opportunities for women, and I think it's important that we go back to the moon with this very diverse and talented astronaut corps under the program called Artemis, and that's what we intend to do. We will be at the Paris Air Show talking about this with all of our international partners, all of our commercial partners. It's a very exciting time, and certainly I will tell you, when we think about who those partners are and who those partners will be, you look at the International Space Station, we have 15 nations that are operating the International Space Station right now. 15 nations. We have astronauts from dozens of countries who have lived and worked on the International Space Station. And in fact, we've had experiments from 103 different nations on the International Space Station. These are the partners that laid the foundation, built the framework for international diplomacy and a coalition of nations that can go back to the moon. Our partnership is going to grow. We're going to be talking to all of our international partners about expanding the international partnership from low Earth orbit all the way to the moon in this sustainable lunar architecture where our astronauts, rovers, landers can go back and forth to the surface of the moon, any part of the moon, over and over again, and under the President's Space Policy Directive 1, utilize the resources of the moon. The architecture that we're developing is open. The way we do communications, avionics, the way we do life support, docking, data, all of this is going to be open. In other words, if you're a small country, maybe you're a private company, maybe you're a publicly traded company, and you have an interest in going back to the moon for commercial reasons, you can plug into our architecture. It's going to be an open architecture, and the United States of America is looking forward to going over to the Paris Air Show and sharing all of this with our international and commercial partners. So it's great to be here. Tom, thank you for your leadership on this, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have here in a few minutes. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Call me a space geek, but I get goosebumps with some of the things that you talk about. So it's a brave new world.